You may have noticed I am not Shannon Loftus. Sorry for the bait and switch. Any of you who came to see Shannon, none of us will be hurt if you leave now. But this is the panel on steps toward improving culture, and it's from our collective experience working on the Xbox team and with the Xbox group. So I'll let the panelists introduce themselves.
My name is Mark Yeend. I'm a creative director in ATG, the Advanced Technology Group in Xbox platform.
My name is Natahri Felton. I manage the outsourcing and middleware group for Microsoft Studios.
My name is Katy Perez, and I'm a senior producer for Breadth Digital Content on Xbox and ID at Xbox.
My name is Katy Meyer, and I am new to Xbox for today's 45 days. But I've been at Microsoft for 16 years and primarily in the global diversity and inclusion space. And so within Xbox, I'm the diversity and inclusion, or D&I lead.
And I'm Alison Stroll. I have been at Xbox since before there was an Xbox, and I've been making games since the Paleolithic era. So let's move on, shall we? Today we intend to discuss how inclusivity fuels innovation, empathy, ecosystem and pipeline, and in-game content. And we hope, even though we started late, that there's going to be a couple minutes for Q&A. If you have a burning question that you feel like maybe won't hit Q&A, and it's burning, you can raise your hand and we'll talk to you, because we're inclusive. So I'm going to know maybe that you can read that, and I'm not going to, because I'm in a hurry, I'm not going to waste the time to read you the text, but inclusivity leads to innovation. And I think we all know a little bit about what that means, but Katy Jo, as she just said, has been brought on to sort of implement that systemically throughout the org, and I would love to hear a little bit about that. You want to kick it off?
Sure. So really, within Microsoft and within the industry, the tech industry as a whole, we've talked about diversity and inclusion. And a lot of times, diversity is the lead foot of that. And I mean, just to yourselves, when you hear the words diversity and inclusion, what comes to mind? Top two things. Race and gender, right? I just read your mind, right? Race and gender, race and gender. And we hear that all the time. And race and gender is very important, and especially within the US, any federal contractor, that's what we are held accountable to tracking. And so a lot of times what you track gets talked about the most. But within Microsoft, when we think about diversity and inclusion, it's way more than race and gender. And then especially when you read about, there's a lot of research within the tech industry around that diversity leads to innovation. And you hear that all the time. And yes, that is true, but there's a very important nugget to that, is that you can have the most diverse room and still not lead to innovation. The key to innovation is that inclusion piece. And it was a lot of what was talked about this morning, is that where every single person feels welcomed, and they can bring their voice to the table, and it will be heard, and they won't be judged. And so that inclusion part is really, really important, and that's what actually leads to the innovation, not the diversity. And the diversity itself, when we talk about diversity and inclusion, that can be, you can have a room full of white men, and a lot of white men are like, oh, it's diversity and inclusion, I'm out, like, I don't fit that. It's so not true, so not true. And that you can have 10 white men, and they have 10 drastically different backgrounds, 10 drastically different life experiences. So every single human being on this planet, and other planets that we may or may not know about, is diversity and inclusion. And so every single person is a part of that. And so within Microsoft, we're really trying to kind of shift the way that people think about diversity and inclusion, with inclusion being that lead foot, that no matter what, we want everyone's voice at the table, because that's really what's going to allow us to create the games and products that everyone can enjoy and be more productive with. So at a high level, that's kind of how we internally think about diversity and inclusion and the direct connection to innovation.
How do you sort of approach the unconscious bias that we've been discussing lately?
Mm-hmm. So unconscious bias is absolutely a huge topic, and it's a very hot topic right now within the tech industry. And within Microsoft, we created a training that is mandatory for all employees to take, but it started with the senior leadership team. But the thing with unconscious bias is recognizing that if you are a human, you have them. And so it's not a bad thing. A lot of times there's judgment about it, but we have to have unconscious biases in order to process and live in this world because we are inundated with so much data. So you have to be able to process things. So the fact that you have unconscious biases is not bad. It is a human fact. It's what you do with those unconscious biases, and are you aware of them? Do you acknowledge them and learn what yours are? And then understand, are these unconscious biases serving me or are they not? And am I making decisions not recognizing that they exist? Or am I recognizing they exist and even being more intentional about the decisions that I make or not? And are they inclusive? And bringing those people to the table. Because a lot of times it's those unconscious biases that stop us from doing things that we have every intention of doing. That's why they're unconscious, you don't know. They prevent us from doing things and creating a lot of goodness that could otherwise come.
I can chime in. So that's eloquent, totally awesome, high level. I was so grateful to see Satya Nadella's internal unconscious bias training. I did it last night before bed, and it was, eye-opening to me to just take a look in the mirror, take a look at myself, and think, oh, I have this. I need to look out for this and be mindful of that in my day-to-day work. And I think as that idea and that awareness percolates through the employees, it's going to affect the games we publish. But to the innovation point that's on the slide, I think indie games are one of the most innovative spaces in the whole industry. And I just spent the weekend at PAX with my kids, and it was mind-blowing. Just the ideas and the audacity that comes from the indie space, usually from tiny little teams. So I'm super pleased that that Xbox has the Idea at Xbox program, and we're here speaking today. On my team in ATG, and in the creative teams that I've managed over the last several years, I've seen tremendous value in openly discussing opposing points of view. And that's, I think, where the rubber meets the road, when diversity hits the content. And I've had people on my teams who are over 50 and under 25 talking about why they like and dislike the creative decisions that we're putting into our games. I've had, obviously, male and female. I've had gay and straight. And these conversations are super awesome and illuminating. But specifically, I was having a conversation with my team about a UX problem. Now, in ATG, we have a creative team of technical art, UX, and audio. And we were bashing around some ideas about some social features, some UX features. And my first idea, because I come from an audio background, was like, let's put it in voice chat. Let's do this positional voice chat thing and make this accessible.
I'm going to stop you there and go,
yeah.
Girls in the room, would you like to, how do you feel about communicating with this game with just voice chat? Anybody love voice chat on, raise your hand if you're female and love voice chat on live or on any game. Oh, no hands raised. Right. Why?
Because then we know you're a girl.
And then what happens?
So this was great because it nipped my idea in the bud. It's like, oh, I have women on my team, and they just told me right out of the gate, very quickly, that's a bad idea. We should put it in text chat. And I'm like, oh, I didn't even think of that because I have unconscious bias. And thank God you're on my team and you're included in this conversation. And that I think was a good lesson that I learned and a good case study.
So for me, I've been at Xbox 14 years, and my background in college was actually child psychology. And so I first started at the company, and I was like, whoa, I feel like an imposter being here in this space. And I was even talking with my boss, and I'm like, I'm sorry, I have so many questions. And he's like, this isn't your area of expertise yet, but that's exactly why we hired you. And so I've actually found in my 14 years at Microsoft that there is a very inclusive culture. I've been in so many meetings where I have had a dissenting opinion, and I feel like not only has that dissenting opinion been heard, but it's actually helped my career in that I've been able to speak up and have other people listen to my ideas, and so I get brought into the conversation to make sure that we do have more inclusion. I actually got to be on the incubation team with Alex Kipman for 5 years, and we were the small team originally creating Connect. And as we were creating our first skeletal tracking prototype for Connect, you know, the developers had made it to work for themselves and Alex, right? And so there were 2 or 3 people, and I was probably the 4th person that stood up in front of the prototype. And as I stood up in front of it, our avatar absolutely collapsed over like that, because it didn't know what to do with my breasts, and it thought that my breasts were my shoulders, and so now all of a sudden we have this avatar on the screen kind of running around like that. You know, and Connect actually proved to be this amazing experience for me because I was not only a woman, but I wore really different clothes. So I would start every morning actually in our developer's office because I had skirts on and I had these flowing things, oops, as I threw my phone, that were very different than what our developers wore to work every day, right? They had their t-shirts and jeans. And so every morning I had to go and start in a T-pose and run around, you know, so that they could look at what materials I had on and things like that.
And that's just the beginning. There was a lot more of Connect recognition that you may or may not have heard about through the grapevine that needed to happen.
Yeah, so I was also pregnant during the making of Connect, so I also had a lot of fun getting to watch the skeletal tracking system track my little one, who was kind of the first baby ever tracked in Connect. So, so there were a lot of things like that too, where, you know, we were just on that small team. It hadn't turned into a full product yet. We were still incubating. But, you know, by having this, you know, by having me on the team, I do feel like I was able to help contribute to that space. And we were able to have a lot of these conversations about where we were going to need to go with the technology.
The same thing happened with voice. Sorry to cut you off. But like you said, the developers were designing for themselves at first to just get it functional. And all of them were male with deep voices. And so we started to expand the audience, then the prototyping exposure to women. And then we, you know, needed to support foreign languages because we knew it would release globally. And so if our internal ecosystem had had more diversity or more native speakers of foreign languages, specifically for Connect, we could have done prototyping more rapidly, and I think maybe landed a little better. But I think that's another good case study that Microsoft is reflecting on and learning from over time.
Well, actually, I had my own Connect story, but for the interest of time, I'll go ahead and keep it to myself. It's actually very interesting. No, I'm not.
No, I'm going to jump on that grenade. No, not now. Beer talk.
Okay.
So I've been at Microsoft for about 15 years, and when I first started, there was a man, obviously you probably know him, Bill Gates, who was running the company. And I was lucky enough to have a mother who instilled a lot of good values in me with regards to diversity and inclusion. But not everyone is able to say that. But one thing I noticed that Bill Gates did was, there was a time he went to Saudi Arabia. And I'm not great at paraphrasing, so I'm going to get this as close as I can. He went over to Saudi Arabia to do a talk, and at the question and answer session, someone asked him, Mr. Gates, is Saudi Arabia ever going to be a big player on the world stage, economically? And Bill Gates gave a very pointed answer and looked at the guy and said, not until you unleash 50% and unlock 50% of your population. And that really stuck with me. And that right there is the power of being able, if you can do that, you are able to unlock a lot of minds and a lot of potential, thereby affecting anything you're creating across industry. So we're talking about games here, but across the country, companies are taking diversity and inclusion seriously. And if we don't get on board with that, we will be left behind. There's 2 reasons that you want to do this. They interviewed 10 CEOs with strong diversity and inclusion initiatives, and they all said similar things. They said, you know what, there's 2 reasons why we're doing this. One, it's morally the right thing to do. We need to do this, we need to be respectful and include people and have an inclusive environment. And the second thing is that it directly affects the bottom line if you get it right. You're leaving a lot of money on the table if you're not reaching out to the individuals that actually play your games. And there's a lot of individuals playing the games that we can reach out to, and if done properly, we'll,
If this brings us right to the empathy in design, I think. So what a great segue. If any of you were at Shannon's talk earlier, that slide that where she talked about the data of who plays what and how much they spend and all that, that all came from this gentleman here who can talk a little bit more about it, which I think is where you were just going.
Absolutely. So what we found was when we looked at the population, African Americans play on average 30 minutes more per week, I believe, than their white counterparts. Hispanics, 10 minutes more. Families that make less than $35,000 a year actually spend more on our games than families making over $75,000 a year. So what this shows is that we are doing very well with these populations financially. They're buying in. They're advocates for our industry. Same with females. Females make up, I believe, over half of all gamers at this point in time. That being said, look at the content. 10%, they did a study on 150 games across different platforms, and they found that roughly 80% of all the characters were white characters. 10% of those characters were African American, and 3% were Hispanic, and there was hardly any Native American representation. And of those 10% of African Americans that showed up in the video games, most of them were athletes or gangsters. So the individuals that are playing our games are very bought in, and they're spending money. And you can argue that the content isn't great. You can argue that the content is potentially offensive. Imagine what we can do if we actually looked at that and spoke to those individuals and created content that is engaging, that is respectful. What would they do? How much more money would they spend on our games? How much better would they feel playing our games if we were able to do that? And other companies are doing it well. Pepsi-Cola started in 2000, has done that. Mountain Dew, different flavors for Mountain Dew, different flavors for their potato chips and their Doritos. They actually reached out to multicultural segments of the population, and it worked. They increased their profit margin by doing that, by pulling people in from those diverse groups, asking them questions, getting it right, and actually selling to those groups appropriately. Lego's another example with the Friends line. The Friends line came out focused on females and girls, and that has done twice as good when it was initially launched than thought. So companies that get it right actually directly affect their bottom line positively, and the gaming industry could do that as well.
And so Katie Jo, I know we're working on doing it right. Do you want to talk a little bit about how Microsoft and how other companies can try to do it right, like these huge corporations he mentioned?
Yeah, well, so we have some initial thoughts, but again, this is something that for a long time people have been trying to do it right? We never try to go after diversity and inclusion and be like, I'm just gonna whatever. We always try to do it right, but a lot of times, as you heard in the talks this morning, we're never gonna always get it right. There's just too many dimensions in human behavior to always get it right. And so when we think about inclusive design, and what does that really mean? And yes, it is the ideal scenario if you could have representation from every different type of person, personality, geography, everything on the team, right? So Connect was better in this situation because there was a female on the team from the beginning, but the reality is that's not gonna happen, right? The team would be ginormous. And so that's not gonna happen. But even if you don't have the most diverse team, you can still build products that are interesting, exciting, fun for a diverse and multicultural audience. And the biggest way that you can do that, or the biggest lever that you can pull, is really building empathy. And so that you can relate to, or at least understand, you might not ever be able to relate, but at least understand the wants, needs, desires, what's exciting to that other person. And kind of what Natahri was talking about, they went out with those successful campaigns, they went out and talked to the people. So it's listening and understanding and really building that empathy muscle so that you can understand what's going on and what those interests are. And so within Microsoft, we're really working a lot on kind of understanding what does inclusive design, so from the very beginning, as opposed to something at the end, we're like, okay, let's double check all these different statistics or data points. But if we bring that to the beginning of the design process, what does that look like? How does that change the product? And how do we connect to our gamers? And maybe not just the gamers we want today, but all different types of gamers.
Again,
and
the Thunder case study
Absolutely.
from earlier was so good.
Yeah, and I also want to be really clear too that this isn't saying to water down every single game so that every single game appeals to everyone. By no means that, because then you're going to lose that fun factor. But it's understanding who that target audience is and really getting to know that target audience.
You could never say Thunder was watered down, just FYI.
Yeah. True. And so it's making sure that we're creating a range of games for all different kinds of gamers, and we're appreciating all different kinds of gamers, and that there are those options as well.
And one way that kind of really where the rubber meets the road with my team is on the UX side of design, and we have a really tight iteration loop with user research. And Xbox has a really robust and highly skilled team of user research. And we bring in people to play test the games, to try to elevate the fun score, and also try to broaden the way the content can resonate. And so that iteration loop and having a lot of different games go through the same team, these teams are starting to learn how to address color blindness, how to address left-handed players, how to address, those are user studies more than minority groups, but I think you get my point. What age range they could target. That's right.
More than specific groups of people. It's each individual snowflake we're talking about.
Totally agree.
I think it's really interesting in this space too, because we tend to be so passionate about video games, those of us who make them, right? We're in this field because we love our craft. We love getting to consume them as well. So I do think that we do have a bias to tend to try to make games that we want to play or the game our child wants to play. And so I do think it's so important for us to step back, because as an industry, we actually do have a lot of really high barriers that we place on our consumers. Look at the number of people who sit and play through video games with a GameFAQs or Wiki open, right? We don't make it very easy for a lot of our consumers to actually consume our content. I've jumped into video games after 3 weeks, and I have no idea which direction I was even walking in, right? I'm in the middle of nowhere. And so we actually put in so many barriers, and as Natahri was saying, if we can, really think about those populations and think about not only the populations in terms of, ethnic diversity and things like that, but also cultural diversity. Do people have time to pick up this video game night after night, or are they going to be coming back to it after a period of time? Do we have cross-generational gameplay happening where, now there's a child sitting in the room, and how can they engage with their parents in this gameplay as well? So I think actually as our medium is evolving, we actually have so many things we need to think about to make our games more accessible and more approachable. And that doesn't mean dumbing down the content and just making it so someone doesn't die, but I do think it means having a very active conversation early on about what do we want that player's journey to be? What does success look like?
It does mean that teams have to set aside some budget for things that they haven't done before. Jessica, who's in the audience, and I worked on Halo for a long time together, and we had some Make-A-Wish kids who were hard of hearing. They couldn't hear at all, and we published stuff, comics and stuff that they would want to hear, and we didn't sub them in English. We subbed them in all the other languages, but we never subbed them in English, and we certainly didn't sub them for the hard of hearing. Closed caption subbing is different from subbing. So we emailed him the text of what he was watching. And, this is a guy who was in bed, and he was a Make-A-Wish kid for 10 years, but he was power to the powerless and voice to the voiceless, and he played Halo every night, where he ego-identified with this powerful character, but he truly himself was bedridden and couldn't even eat. So we have to think about these guys as well and really bring them along, because it's the right thing to do, as you said, and is right for the bottom line. Empathy for all.
Yeah, I was just reading yesterday about blind gamers. Incredible. People who are blind can play video games if you think about your sound design as iconography, and you think about your music interactivity and your audio feedback as a true embedded gameplay mechanic. And I think that's super powerful. But one other thing I wanted to say about empathy, I was working on a game, which was a dance game prototype, before Dance Central came out, working on Connect. And we hired a Japanese developer to make this because they'd done a ton of rhythm games and music games, and they were really awesome. And went to Japan and kind of showed them the Kinect, and they're like, our houses are not as big as American houses. This Kinect thing won't scan our little rooms. You can't see below the knees. You can't, you have to be really close to the screen when you play a video game in Japan. And I think that exposure to a group that we were unfamiliar with and a culture that we didn't know about was super powerful and made the product better. It made Kinect better and made Dance Central better by proxy.
It was a great, I remember that moment, that learning, it was great. So unless you guys want to, and a name check Jessica, so you got anything? Okay. Ecosystem and pipeline. Who wants to start here?
I can start on that one. So Katy Jo, as she mentioned, we're looking at trying to increase what we already have at Microsoft with regards to diversity and inclusion. And the interesting thing that we saw was if you look at trying to get diverse candidates and people with different backgrounds to come into our organization, that's a multifaceted issue. It's not good enough for us to say, okay, we're going to try to target 12% of these individuals or 8% of those individuals. The reason I say that is because it's a bigger issue than that. You may not even be able to grab that many individuals because the pool of individuals that are even available may not be able to support that. So you have to look at everything. You have to look at the availability, how many females are in the marketplace that have the skills you need, how many African Americans, Latinos, and so on are in the field, in the field that are able to be accessed. So we found that we had an issue with the pipeline as well as trying to get individuals to come in. And once they're in, you need to make sure you have a welcoming environment so that they stay. So those are some of the issues that we dealt with. When I was growing up, I remember the word colorblind. We were told to be colorblind. We were told to be gender blind. And that was a good step in the right direction. But the problem with being colorblind is what you end up doing potentially is just having a whole bunch of people that look different that assimilate and start giving the same stuff out. So there's a difference between colorblind and gender blind, and now we need to move into the world of color conscious and gender conscious. I remember hearing a story about Harvard Business School that at one point in time there weren't that many women in Harvard Business School, like in the middle of the last century. Women started coming to the school for various different reasons, and they found out that the women didn't have anywhere to go to use the restroom. There was one place in Harvard in the very middle where you could have a female bathroom next to a male bathroom, and they were able to use that one. The individuals at Harvard thought, there's a bathroom there, you just have to take a 10-minute walk. And obviously the females didn't take too kindly to that. And finally, after they protested because they didn't have a bathroom, how dare they, finally, Harvard put a bathroom in the building that was welcoming individuals, but that bathroom was put downstairs near the janitor office, and it was not very welcoming. So what they did was they had a female bathroom. They made sure it was steps away from where the females were. But is that really an inclusive environment? Does that really make you feel like you're welcome when you go there? Yeah, you could put a checkbox there. There is a female restroom. But that didn't create an environment that a female would want to stay. And so there's a difference between colorblind, gender blind, and color conscious and gender conscious. So back to the pipeline. We are looking at ways to increase that pipeline and be able to do something for the longer term for the industry and the country as a whole. One of the things that we've done is paired up with a company or a project called Year Up. Year Up is a nationwide program that I think President Obama has spoken about that on a few different occasions over the last year. It's a program that targets typically inner city youth from underrepresented groups. There's females and males in this population. They're very motivated, smart, intelligent individuals that just don't know how to get their foot into the corporate world for whatever reason, the situations that they're in, the neighborhoods that they grew up in. Mom and dad may not know how to make that transition. Well, Year Up helps these individuals gain the skills they need to have the core skills they need to get into the corporate environment. So Year Up takes 6 months to train these individuals, give them those skills, and be able to place them in various companies. Microsoft has been partnering with this group for about 5 years. It started with having individuals come in and do games testing, and we're increasing that now to the point where we have positions for business intelligence and test intelligence, more technical positions that are able to be provided to these individuals so that they could do their 6 months of training and then 6 months on the job at Microsoft. And they they partner with other companies as well. But that's an example of how we're trying to work with our partners in the corporate world to increase the pool in general, because we have a problem on both sides, getting people, retaining people, and then the pool that we're pulling from in the first place.
There are some of us who have been around long enough, or it's our personalities, to be the disruptor, to say, hey, I want a bathroom here, you know? And I just moved into DirectX and in the graphics group across Microsoft for PC, Xbox, everything. And I'm the only one on the team who has ever made a video game. So they brought me in to be the disruptor, because nobody raise your hand if you're a video game developer and love being talked to about how to make a video game by people who have never made one. Anyone? Show of hands? Right. Dave McCoy loves that more than anything. So there's the disruptor, which is sort of the hard part, and then there's the nurturing in the pipeline. So I know that we're working, the disruptors sort of have to happen. There's like a thing, an incident, no bathroom, pretty obvious. But then there's the sustainability in the pipeline. How are we handling that?
So I'll talk about a couple programs, and I wanted to actually take one step back from building the pipeline and kind of address some of the ecosystem things from an inclusive culture perspective in particular. So we have a culture inside, and if we want to get other people to come in, we need to be really aware, starting with our job descriptions. How do we even advertise a job? And is the language that we use in that job description interesting, exciting, and appealing to a wide variety of people, or is it appealing to people just like us, right? And that's a huge thing. And a lot of times it's appealing to people just like us, and we're like, why don't we have a diverse pipeline? We've got all these open jobs, and everyone complains. When you look at the job description itself, it reads for a very particular profile of person. And the other, not only the words that are used, but also there's a real difference between a job requirement and a job preference. Right? A job requirement is, what are the skills that you need to do that are required to get the job done? A job preference is something that's just nice to have. Like, if you like to play these kinds of games, and if you've been playing games since you were 2, that's nice to have. But you might be a designer of one and you have all these designer skills, but maybe just never made them in a game. You've made them in another industry, but you have the same skills. And so sometimes it's letting go of some of those things that we have in our heads that's a requirement, when really, is it really a requirement, or is that a preference? And that's hard, because sometimes hiring people that are different than you, it takes more work. Let's not even lie. It takes more work. But to be innovative, a lot of times that brings us to a different place, right? And allows us to create a different output when there are people that are different than us. So it starts even at the job description, is being very mindful of the job requirement versus a job preference, and then the language that you use throughout the job description. And there's actually a really good resource. It's ncwit.org. That stands for National Coalition of Women in Technology, I think. Don't quote me on that, but ncwit.org, I know that. Know the acronym. But on there, within Workplace, they have a checklist, and they have tips for for reducing bias in job descriptions. It's a great, great resource. I highly recommend it. But then, so once we get past the job descriptions and we think about who are we attracting, it's not just a matter of putting the jobs out there, especially from a technology perspective, when we think we need to build that pipeline and the diverse pipeline. And so Microsoft has invested in several different programs at all different points in that pipeline. And we really started investing heavily in high school. So how do we get kids in high school excited about technology, excited about a career in technology, and excited about games? And so one program is called DigiGirls. It's a program that's targeted towards high school girls, where we host a week-long camp at Microsoft campus, but then we also have what's called Digi Days all the way around the world. And the program has been around, I believe it's 15 years. I think we just had our 15-year anniversary, but we're starting to see girls who started in the high school program, we kept them all the way through college, they came back as interns, and now they're graduating and coming back as full-time people. So we kept them through the pipeline. And so how do we invest young in that part of the pipeline? But it's very intentional investment and a long-term investment to keep people in. And I know Katy's got another example
Yeah, thanks, Katie Jo. So one of the programs that I've been really excited to be a part of lately is Girls Make Games, which was started by Layla Sabir over at Learn District. And so Layla actually went to open a position on her team and actually found that all of the resumes that were coming in were for men. And she was like, why am I not getting any of these applicants? And then she actually talked to people and they were like, girls don't make games. And she's like, yes, they do. So she decided to actually found Girls Make Games. And so it's actually a 3-week summer camp that we had the opportunity to form a sponsorship with. And so the girls actually come in and they actually learn not only coding, but they also learn game design and art and how to actually pitch. And the girls actually come up with a pitch. And at the end of these camps, they kind of submit their pitches. And then the top 5 pitches from around the country actually get flown to Mountain View. And the girls get to present their titles. And then the top pitch actually goes on to get kickstarted. And I'm super excited because we actually have the very first game from Girls Make Games, The Whole Story, coming to Xbox next year. So at our event last week...
That's so awesome. I didn't even know about that. That's so great.
So at our event last week, we had 2 of the girls actually fly up and get to demo their games to reporters and all of our consumers at our pre-PAX event. And it was amazing to watch, you know, this 16-year-old girl, Evan, talk with such passion and such dedication about the game she was working on. And it was so cool because she's sitting there and she actually learned so much too. She's like, oh, I saw them, you know, struggle with this and I need to go back and fix this. And she's such a game developer already, you know, and she's just started on this journey. And so this program literally takes kids who have no exposure to games and makes them game developers. And I'm so excited for Evan's content to be coming out next year on our platform. And I'm so excited that, you know, her path is very clear. She's very clear moving forward in that space.
Yeah, I have a couple of anecdotes as well. We had a college hire program, and we had this gal come from Harvard with a dual major in, you know, computer science and creative writing, and she spoke 3 languages, and she was super amazing and like did all this amazing stuff. Somehow, she ended up reporting to me, and I felt unqualified to manage her. She was such a superstar, but you know, I had her for 6 months in my program. Then she cycled through to the Xbox Live group, and I think you raised a really good point about retaining great people. So what could I do as a manager? I could create, you know, teach her everything I know, create a super friendly environment, and make her welcome to the team. Write a great recommendation for her when she transitions to her next team. And then every time I see her at a trade show or whatever, I mean, she was demoing at E3, and now she's at 343 making Halo games. She's having, I think she's in her 3rd or 4th year at Microsoft now, so she's thriving. And I hope I was a part of that, of her success story. And as far as like, I think your examples are great for feeding the pipeline with young talent, but there's also a need for fluidity of senior talent across the industry. And I found, especially in my group, in ATG, we're expected to have a level of expertise. And so recently when I had an open head for an audio person, I went to extra effort as the hiring manager to recruit and make sure that I had a viable female candidate, as well as all the piles and piles of men that were applying for this job. And so that was, I think, successful from my perspective in terms of what I could control as a manager. It's not systemic to Microsoft, but it's just having awareness as a manager and putting in the extra effort.
Retaining individuals is extremely important, and I didn't give my Connect story, I saved the time, but I will give you a different story. So I grew up on the east side in the Seattle, Washington area, and it was, there were 2 African-American kids in the school. It was me and the son of Bill Gregory, number 77 of the Seahawks. I was able to convince people that I was related to Michael Jackson, and that worked then. It probably wouldn't have worked in the 90s. But the point I'm trying to make is that, I experienced it. I have a pretty thick skin, so I'm not saying this story to have people feel sorry for me or anything, because I'm okay with it. But I live in a nice neighborhood. And there are times when people who come and service my house, sometimes they think I'm servicing the house too, and we got to find the owner. Or they'll say something like, and very rarely does somebody say, you must be an engineer, you must be a doctor, you know, you must be a lawyer. It's always, who do you play for? I did Griffey's house. Come on, can I get an autograph? That's what I go through. I went through this literally 3 weeks ago. So I'm okay with it. You know, some people may think that's pretty cool. But the point I'm trying to make is that's an unconscious bias. That could really irritate someone. And so when you have an environment when you're pulling people in, the Seattle, Washington area is far off to a lot of individuals that are in places like Atlanta. It's some place that people don't really think about. That's where the Sasquatch is, but they don't, so bringing a person who, I grew up here, I love this place, but people who are coming here from other locations, they may not want to stay, and it may be totally out of your control. So just something to keep in mind.
One more point I want to make to the hiring practices too that we've found to be very successful is to really focus in on the skills that we're looking for, as Katie Jo was saying, versus asking a question that just leads to the experience that that person has today. And I think that there's such a difference there, and a lot of times those skills are very applicable and can even be found in other areas demonstrated, and so you have to be very conscious of how you're asking your questions, because if you ask your questions in a way in which people can take their own experiences and look at how they're demonstrating that skill set, then you'll actually find a lot more people that are strong and actually qualified for, I think, the position as well, versus just looking someone who can tell you, and can rattle off the exact differences between, two specific game engines or something like that. So I think we've also found that to be a success within our team.
So we have one last topic, and I'm hoping we can get in a couple of questions, but I don't know how prompt the next panel will be. So maybe we can camp in here for a minute. But it's in-game content, and I know that all of you have strong opinions on this, so I'm going to let you wrestle for who's going to start. Arm wrestling, go.
I'll start. So I am so honored to be a part of IGDA at Xbox. So IGDA at Xbox allows developers all over the world to actually ship their content onto Xbox One and Windows 10. And with that, we have hundreds of games in development, which means that we have this amazing amount of diversity within our portfolio. And it's so amazing because we not only have amazing diversity with the creators themselves and the narratives that they're starting to tell and the stories and even how they're telling them, but we're also seeing just an amazing amount of diversity in the audiences that people are starting to target. Seeing titles come through the portfolio that target very specific health or educational needs. And I think that's so cool that we're having a stronger voice for that, not only on console, but also on the Windows 10 platform. We had, a couple games that have launched to the program that I've personally so enjoyed. Never Alone was one that came out last year for us. That's the story of an Inuit girl and her foxes. They're kind of making a journey. And my favorite part of the game actually is as you're playing through, you're actually unlocking these cultural videos. And as soon as I unlock one of those videos and I see it pop up, I jump immediately back to the main menu and I watch the video because that's one of my favorite parts of the game. We also had an amazing game just come out called Beyond Eyes. And Beyond Eyes is the story of Ray, who is a little girl.
Can you say the name of the game again?
Beyond Eyes.
Beyond Eyes.
Beyond Eyes, and it's the story of Ray, who is blinded in an accident and is now faced with venturing out into the world for the first time because her friend, which is a little cat, has kind of gone missing, and so she's decided to venture out. And I had the most amazing experience playing this when it came out 2 weeks ago with my daughter, who's 6. And we were playing it, and Lizzie was controlling it, and we had so many interesting questions that came up, and she said, well, Mama, why can't I go faster? Okay, well, let's talk about that. If you're blind, can you just run forward in the environment if you're using your other senses? And, well, why does, that look like a clothesline, and then it changes to something else? Well, if you're using your other senses, what would that be, and what would that seem like? And it was so touching for my daughter that for the next week, I constantly found her role-playing what it was like to be blind. And so Lizzie ate lunch that day as if she was blind, and she wanted to, we were walking at the park and she wanted me to guide her. And so I was so proud, actually, that the form that we all love so much of video games had taught my daughter empathy for what it would be like to be in that situation. So I think there's just amazing content, and I'm honestly so honored to be a part of IGDA at Xbox.
It's a great program.
Hello. I have some content examples from my team. I've been super proud and honored to work with some strong senior female art directors and artists. And on Sunset Overdrive, it was a lot of hard work, but who here has played Sunset Overdrive or seen some of the marketing materials? It's one of the most unique looking games to come out in the last 2 years, I think, the color palette, the line weight, the character design, and what they just agonized over it and they discussed it. And two things that they did that I'll just call out among the many things that they did. One was to incorporate a forward-thinking fashion sense to the character customization bit. They really went deep on the fashion angle. And it's outlandish what you can do with your character, but it's also can be very surprisingly hip. And I thought that was super impressive. The other thing they did was hold their male counterparts on the development team accountable for the tone, and really were advocates to portraying the characters in just a really positive way, a consistent way, and a non-offensive way. And I think that really, for the most part, came off really well. I mean, it's still a crass game. There's vulgarity. There's,
But the customization sounds like the payoff of Backpack Girl when we first announced Xbox.
Yeah.
What was that, 1 or 360? Prime or 360 with Backpack Girl, and you remember her. That, you could create, and it was something for everybody.
Yeah, we also had a female narrative designer in the publishing team who was deeply involved in setting the tone, making sure all the jokes were funny and not crappy.
And Kate really has saved our collective butts in shipping games more times than any of us can tell you.
Yeah.
So we really owe, as an industry, anybody who has used Kate as a resource owes her a huge debt of thanks for not being recalled, as some were.
I can't take credit for any of that work, but I was the manager of the team that was doing that work, and I was super proud, and I fanned the flames, and I positioned them in the right place to, to support them and have the right conversations. And that's as much as I could do, and the rest was their expertise and their perspective that was making the product better.
Well, sometimes just setting the sandbox so that it's comfortable and inclusionary is all that we can do while we're not the demographic, perhaps.
Yeah, you do what you can.
So we have entirely an minute for a question, unless you didn't get to say anything on this.
Really quickly, one thing I noticed, we're talking about color, we're talking about gender, and it's so much more than that, as Katie Jo said at the end. As we try to reach out to these different groups, as we try to think about how they're feeling and empathy, let's not forget that there is the quote-unquote majority as well. We don't want to make the white male feel excluded as we try to include everyone else. So
Bill O'Reilly says he is already excluded. He has said that. I'm not joking.
It's a big issue. So we have to make sure that we're taking all groups into consideration, is what I'm trying to say.
I feel honored just to be on the panel.
All right, we have a question. So you want to step up here? We'll hand you a mic. Thank you for being the first.
I really enjoyed the talk, and I'm a little bit nervous to ask this question because I don't want to put you guys on the spot.
We love being on the spot.
When the Microsoft CEO was talking about pay scale and karma, I see all of your amazing efforts.
To handle that.
That's a serious question, though, right?
Yeah, oh yeah.
I see all of your amazing efforts, and I would imagine if I heard that, I know it was taken out of context, it would affect my morale a little bit, and I would wonder if people who are interviewing to come on board, if that would be on their minds at all. And I know as a consumer, it crossed my mind.
I'd like to say that I know that he has, so it was taken out of context, and it's not what, he has said it's not what he meant. However, he has learned that, as Rami, I think, said, everything you say is on the record, and if you say it, you own it, and he has learned from it, and there have been a lot of great projects that he has started when he understood the backlash that happened as a result of that. That backlash was the disruptor that is causing the change at the company. I can see it myself. I've been there 17 years. It's the biggest change I've seen.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. So I was in the audience when he said that, because that's when I was on the Global Diversity and Inclusion team. And when you say something like that, we're like, ooh, like that didn't go out right. But the power in that moment and in the next 24 hours, we're like, this could really go either way. This could be a disaster, or this could be a pivotal learning moment. And that's almost when we saw Satya's true colors from this perspective, and it was absolutely a pivotal learning moment. And this is
really
something
had never been on this stage before. I mean, who has? Who's taken the shoes of Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer?
Absolutely, yeah. And as an employee myself, so I was like, oh my gosh. And I'm in the diversity and inclusion, org. How do I stay on this team? But with him as the CEO, I was more inspired than I ever have been from a diversity and inclusion perspective. And one of the things that I value so much in Satya is that there is kind of what Natahri was talking about earlier. There's kind of the two reasons to do diversity and inclusion. There's the moral piece, and it's just, so we call that the values case. But then there's the business case. And Satya is taking both of those and driving full force. It's not one or the other, and they're not mutually exclusive. Both have their place, and both are really important for every employee to understand. But the way in which he took that learning to heart, and he sent an employee, a mail to all employees the very next day of like, hey, I said this, I own it, here's where my head was, here's what I've learned, and here's what I'm gonna do differently because of it. And so he took it as a learning moment. And even kind of what Rami said earlier, that failure's gonna happen, right? But it's, do you own it, and do you communicate it, and do you change because of it? So if anything, he created a safer environment for us internally to make a mistake.
His
so it's
actions
okay.
have spoken so loud. The number, I think, of women in very senior roles have doubled in this certain class of roles. I think it's doubled or something since he took. I think he's been very proactive. So while that statement was definitely tone deaf, it's
turned into some very tangible changes at every level of the company that has been very, very positive, not only from a diversity perspective, but also just in the culture and more inclusive. Like, it's okay to try something, make a mistake, fail, and come back even stronger for it. So he's really set that tone for us.
Fail fast.
Which is really, really cool. And especially in this space where it can be scary. And then right after that, I spoke with several leaders. They're like, well, I'm never talking on diversity and inclusion again. Look what happened to him. But then because of his actions over the next couple months, they're like, okay, wait, it is okay. So I will lean in. I will engage in this conversation and learn, because it's through the dialogue that anything is ever going to happen. And that's why he even went to Grace Hopper. He was the first male CEO to ever give a keynote at Grace Hopper. He was in front of 8,000 women. Like, can you imagine how intimidating that was as a brand new CEO? And so it was really courageous of him to go. And so that's kind of, we're really looking at that whole picture and then his actions since. So it's actually turned into a really inspiring thing as opposed to a black eye.
I completely agree. It was awesome. And it's not just spin, it's what he means. Yeah, hit it.
It's great to hear you talk so much about empathy. What are specific techniques?
They're recording, so if you
We got to have it recorded.
It's great to hear you talk so much about empathy. What are specific techniques you use to train empathy in your teams?
So for me, one of the things that I've seen, or one of the tactics I've done, not to train empathy in the team as much, but to sort of foster it within the studio, is create a safe place for all the different people, or let them create a safe place for all the different people. Sort of, what were you calling it? The social comfort zone. I was calling it the monkey sphere, the monkey sphere is, you have 150 people in humans, and outside of that, people are two-dimensional displays of themselves, and you don't know them, and you don't work with them well. But I think there was a TED Talk on that. But if you create these mentoring groups that, for your specific area, you can, or belong to one, you can find other people and create a larger monkey sphere and create a different group, a network. For instance, I've seen that work really well.
In my experience too, usability, has been the greatest gift as a producer that I've ever been able to give a partner. Watching developers sometimes very painfully struggle on the other side of a glass wall, watching someone play through their game. Why don't they get it? Why can't they hit that? And so I think that that's really interesting. I also think bringing new people into the fold is really interesting, you know, as we heard in the keynote this morning, like having to actually share your content because it gets you out of that team think, right? Even, you know, I joined one project and the AI was beating me up uncontrollably. Like, it was ridiculous, right? And it's just because they had all been playing it for so long, they had no problem with it. So I think that's another area. And then I think another area is to be just really clear with consumer scenarios as well. So Microsoft, I think we actually have a strong background in terms of writing specifications and defining who our consumer segments are and kind of writing out their stories. And then by actually thinking through the customer's journey and what is success and what is failure. If this user has this happen, this will be failure in this level. How do we prevent that? What do we think about, you know, when they do encounter failure scenarios, how do we help them get past that so that they can continue to engage? Again, if they can't actually even consume our content, the likelihood that they're going to purchase our sequels or they're going to purchase our DLC and things like that are going to be much, much lower. So really thinking about that success.
Are we answering your question, or did you mean something else?
No, you're doing a great job.
So I want to add something too. So someone gave me, or someone shared this metaphor that I thought was really, really powerful, and so I want to share it with you. We were going through an inclusive design process internally within Microsoft, and it was important to clarify the distinction between sympathy and empathy, right? They're very, very different. And a lot of times, our unconscious biases play a role where we don't know the difference in our actions unless we're being very intentional about sympathy versus empathy. And so the way that she told this story, this metaphor, to really differentiate between sympathy and empathy is if you were driving down the road and it's pouring down rain out and you see someone walking, sympathy would be like, oh, you're getting wet, let me give you an umbrella, hand them the umbrella and keep driving, right? So a lot of times we look at other people, and this is in everyday life, but we look out with our filters, unconsciously, with our filters, we assume what they want based on what I can judge of what, you know, your life is like just by looking at you. And, oh, it's raining, they must want an umbrella, here, I'll give it to you, right? Because if I was in the rain, I would want an umbrella, sweet, so I'll do that for you, right? But empathy, the difference is you get out and walk with them in the rain. And so you don't just hand them the umbrella, you go and walk that journey with them. And so walking that journey with them might mean a lot of different things, but it's engaging in that conversation. And that's really how you create empathy at a deep level, is it leads back to that inclusive culture. And when you create that safe place for anyone to bring their voice to the table and have that dialogue, that's really how you build that empathy, when you can walk with that person, not just look at them and think, what would you want done in that situation, but walking with them. I just thought that was really powerful, and she said it came from her grandma, and I was like, wow, your grandma's brilliant. It's so powerful.
One more quick thing on pipeline, because I know indie devs are really strapped for resources, and Microsoft has a lot of resources, like the Usability Lab that Katy mentioned. We also have a geopolitical team that actually looks at all the content to make sure it doesn't offend other nations when we ship globally. That's a luxury, right, that indie developers don't typically have. But it's part of our pipeline. I guess if I was translating that intention to an indie dev scenario, it could be a checklist. You know, it could be just something like a gut check with different, you know, cultural groups, different usability, different input modalities, whatever it might be. Does that help? It's a bit more practical. Katy Jo is much more inspirational.
I don't know. We can keep talking until we get kicked out. I'm not sure. But you had a question?
If we still have more time, yes. With development in games, there's rarely a straightforward, easy choice. Here's a tough one. Do you give no example, or I'm going to use the term a stereotypical example? Let's say a group of white straight male protagonists, or a group of diverse yet stereotyped protagonists? One or the other.
It kind of goes back to what I was saying about colorblind versus color conscious. You put my kids in a room and you ask them to test Xbox Snap. They won't know what you're talking about. And the reason they won't know what you're talking about is because they're able to go back to their house with the 5 LCD screens upstairs. If I tell them I'm watching TV, they go to another Xbox. Some families don't have that ability to do that. And so stereotypically, one may look at my kids and say, oh, I know where you live. So I don't think I would go the stereotypical route. I would think about what Katie Jo said with regards to there's many different kinds of diversity, from shipping a title only using, because we're in Redmond, Washington, everybody has LCD screens here. Some of our users have tube televisions, and you can't read things on the HUD. So I would say no stereotype, but I would say think about all the different versions of diversity where there's cultural differences, class differences, economic differences. I would go that route and look and see exactly what you need and then find the group you're talking about.
As a company, too, I've been so proud of the consumer listening feedback systems that we've actually started at Microsoft and Xbox, where we're actually using consumers to tell us which games should come next from back compatibility and things like that. And so that's another thing. I think engaging with your audience and finding out what they're really looking for and bringing them into the fold as part of your creative process is so powerful. And I think that it's also, if you think about it, by engaging the consumers along your creative journey, how much more likely are they, even if you even ask them, hey, what about this character or what, things like that, when you then come to release, how much more vested are they in not only purchasing the content, but telling their friends to purchase it as well, because they've gotten to come on that journey with you.
Kate's here to tell us to stop it,
Wrap it
but
up.
we were just talking about geopoly, I swear. And but I would one final answer for you is I would say the world is not black and white, and Microsoft does not live in a 1 or 2, A or B world. We create the third choice, and Dave McCoy taught me 20 years ago that your first two, your first answer is almost always never right, your second answer is almost always never right. Go to a third or fourth choice. I would challenge your designer to say, really, that's what you've got, stereotypical or not? What about something else? And I've never met a designer who failed to meet a challenge such as that. So, Kate is here, I think, to tell us to shut up. Yeah.